In this lecture, we'll learn about the responsive helper utilities. With these utilities, you can preserve the intrinsic aspect ratio for embedded elements, iframes, embeds, videos, and objects, and control the floating of individual elements responsively. Before we start, please notice that I've chosen to set the width of the embedded objects to 50% to better see the difference. First, let's take a look at the responsive embeds, which are used to preserve the intrinsic aspect ratio for iframes, embeds, videos, and objects. The code and structure are the same for these 4 different elements, so in the examples we'll only look at iframes. First, we need to create a wrapping container to preserve the intrinsic aspect ratio of the embedded element. This container is a div element with the class embedResponsive. Then we'll create an iframe element inside the div with a link to a YouTube video as the source. Now we need to add the class embedResponsiveItem. But we're not there yet. We also need to consider what the aspect ratio is and apply one of 4 different modifier classes. This video has an aspect ratio of 16:9, so let's add the class embedResponsive 16:9 to the wrapping container div. Before we look at it in the browser, we'll create 3 copies of the code and change the modifier class to embedResponsive 4:3, embedResponsive 1:1, and embedResponsive 21:9. When we resize the browser window, we can now see that the embeds are responsive. Now let's have a look at how to control the floating of individual elements. Let's create 3 div elements with some text inside. To float the first div element to the left, we add the class floatLeft. To float the second div element to the right, we add the class floatRight. To prevent the third div element from floating at all, we add the class floatNone. Let's have a look in the browser. These float utilities can also be used responsively, as we know it from other utilities. To see this, let's change the text and class name of the div elements from before. The first div element should be floated right for small devices and up. The second div element should be floated right for medium devices and up. And the third div element should be floated right for large devices and up. You can of course also use the floatLeft and floatNone classes, but to better see the effect we'll stick to the floatRight class. Let's see this in action in the browser. We'll start with resizing the browser window until it's very narrow and then gradually increase the width. We have now learned how to use the responsive helper utilities. Go on and continue with the coding exercises, which will help you learn the correct structure for this utility. In the next lecture, we will learn about the screen reader utilities.